Welcome everybody. Nice to see you all and nice to have you here again for the Irish Influence once more. And I'll remind you even straight away, guys, that the question and answer and the chat are open there. So anything you want to put to us, don't hesitate, put them along and we'll put them to our guests here tonight who are about to be introduced by Mike Cronin. Mike, please.
Thank you, Joe. So we're very lucky tonight. Our two guests, beginning with Ailbhe Darcy, who's at the School of English Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff University, and she's a poet and a critic. Her most recent collection of poetry is Insistence, published in 2018 with Bloodaxe, which won Wales Book of the Year and the Piggott Prize for Poetry in association with Listowel Writers Week. In February 2020, she presented Alphabet on BBC Radio 4, a programme about Ian Christensen's extraordinary poem Alphabet and its resonance in the age of climate change. Her previous collection was Bloodaxe is Imaginary Menagerie, 2011, a poetic text in collaboration with S.J. Fowler. Subcritical Text 2017 is published by Gorse Editions. David Wheatley, our other guest, is at the School of Language, Literature, Music and Visual Culture at the University of Aberdeen. He also is a poet and critic with particular research in the interest in the field of 20th century and contemporary poetry, Irish literature and Samuel Beckett. His most recent poetry collection is The President of Planet Earth, Carcanet, Wake Forest, 2017, and has published 4 previous collections with Gallery Press. Thirst in 1997, which won a Wheatley Prize for Literature, Misery Hill 2000, Mocha 2006, and A Nest of Waves 2010. And together, and we'll get to this later, they've edited the Cambridge History of Irish Women's Poetry, a work that captures the long history of women's poetry writing in Ireland. It's a groundbreaking and comprehensive account of Irish women's poetry from earliest times to the present day. It reads Irish women's poetry through many prisms: mythology, gender, history, the nation, and most importantly, close readings of the poetry itself. So, thank you and welcome. Just to begin with, a first question, and you can take it in turn and have a conversation with each other, is can you just tell us a bit about your own individual pathways into poetry? So maybe Ailbhe, do you want to go first alphabetically?
Yeah, sure. I never know how to answer this question. How did you become a poet? Because I feel like I just started writing poetry when I was a kid, as children do, and I just didn't really stop, which is a silly answer, but it's kind of the truth. And I suppose, you know, there's probably reasons for that I don't really know. But the two reasons that I do know are firstly that I kind of grew up in a time and a place and in a family who I think, took poetry seriously as something that mattered to the world. My mom was writing as I came up. She was publishing mostly fiction, but also some poetry in magazines and getting paid for it, which was very impressive. And I think she bought me sort of poetry anthologies as a child. Lifelines in particular was very important to me as a child. That was an anthology where it was made by Wheatley School, which is a school in Dublin, and the students got famous people to write letters about their favourite poems. So that kind of impressed me as with that sense of poetry as something that people reach for at important moments or out of love. And then the other reason why I didn't stop writing poetry, I think is because at every corner, kind of all the way from there to here, there's always somebody to encourage me or support me or take an interest, which is also what's really important. So I met David, for instance, because I sent him a pamphlet of my poetry. I had a pamphlet come out in 2009, and I wouldn't have had that pamphlet only for Les Robinson and Tall Lighthouse kind of publishing a series of pamphlets to give young poets a step up. Obviously because of people like him and because of editors like Declan Mead at the Stinging Fly who published some of my early poems, there was that kind of sense that people were interested and people were reading. So yes, I think that's what happens if there's a social world for it, that you keep going.
Brilliant. And David?
Well, what Ailbhe has just said reminds me of that lovely phrase of Synge's from the introduction to the Playboy of the Western World, where he says that all art is a collaboration. Kind of double-edged phrase, but very much one that was true in my case too. Ailbhe has talked about her childhood. My own, I think, is an unremembered blank where those questions are concerned. But I do have more vivid memories of being a student in my early 20s and of sitting in a room in Dublin and moving words around on the page, a bit like Scrabble tiles, but they weren't really connecting. I did that for a while, and eventually some talented friends and contemporaries of mine came along and dragged me out and plugged me back into reality. And I benefited greatly from those collaborative networks and friendships too, and continue to do so to the present day, I think.
That's wonderful. Ailbhe, could I just go back to actually to some of your background? You spent some time in Notre Dame, where you did, I think, an MA and your doctorate. Is that correct there? That doesn't seem to me, I wouldn't have thought that South Bend in the middle of America is the most poetic of landscapes, but maybe I'm totally wrong. How was that?
You're so wrong. So first of all, I did not go to Notre Dame. I went to Notre Dame.
Oh, I'm in trouble with a lot of people for that one.
I mean, I fell in love with South Bend. South Bend is a kind of, I mean, it's such an interesting place. It's this sort of post-industrial city, American city. And it's where Studebaker cars used to be made. So it's kind of landscape where, well, my experience of it was that sort of nature was always trying to take it back, that it was kind of on the precipice. So the house that we lived in, there were raccoons and groundhogs kind of living under the house, and squirrels living over the house, and weird bugs turning up in the bathroom. So there was just this sense of kind of living on the edge in some strange way, which is what I wrote about, right? My last collection is all about South Bend. It's all about that sense. And my son was born in South Bend. So that was kind of another alien life form coming into the house. And just thinking about the idea of America in that context, and also, you know, this kind of moment we're living in of a climate crisis. It was so evocative for me, that place.
That's marvelous, marvelous. And can I go a little bit further and then just ask about the return to Ireland? And I know indeed that you've been around, and you're not even living in Ireland at the moment, but Germany and Wales at the moment. But about that sense of return, and you've written, I think, about the Odysseus and the Odyssean wisdom, and then maybe the other image of kind of Abraham, and where do you belong within that? What was the experience of returning to Ireland? And how at home did you feel then as a poet?
Well, I don't think I have returned. I always have this idea that I will eventually, but it's always being deferred. You know, I didn't sort of intend to go away for so long, but things kind of changed while I was away, and it wasn't as easy to come back. And you know, I mean, that idea of Abraham is that things change in you when you're away. So there is no you to come back. So you kind of end up wandering. So yeah, I don't know. I certainly imagined myself being an Irish poet, and imagined writing to and for, or a Dublin poet maybe, writing to and for an audience of people who I'd grown up with. But I don't know if that's true anymore. Yeah, I don't really have, I don't know. It's a lot of I don't knows in that answer, which I suppose it remains to be seen.
And presumably poetry is one of the ways in which you're trying to work out those don't knows and come to some kind of...
Of course. Yeah, so I do kind of periodically go back to Dublin in my poems, and always with a sense of of it having changed so much that it's not the place that I left is gone completely. And yeah, trying to explore, you know, whether there is something there for me to go back to.
Wonderful, thanks. Thank you.
And absolutely, I mean, talking about poetry, unusually amongst our guests on the Irish Influence, I think you might be the first guest we've had who are both creative writers, poets, and also scholars. So how do you manage that difference in register between one day of the week being an academic and another day of the week being a poet?
David, do you have a go?
Well, I go first there. Well, I think I have tried to work that out, and the answer would be that if I was writing a piece of journalism, for instance, I can imagine the reader thinking that that's too academic, and that I can imagine if I write a piece of academic criticism, I can imagine the reader thinking that's too journalistic. And so I like being between those different worlds and maybe mixing it up in both directions. It seems like a good balance to me. I enjoy moving between different identities, which are either two halves that do or don't add up to one unitary individual. I'm not sure, and deliberately getting that gear change wrong as I try and shift between the different roles.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you talk about two registers, I think I always feel like whenever you sit down to write anything, you have to start from scratch again, right? You have to learn how to write again. And I think that's as true for any kind of academic work as it is for poetry. So I feel like there's a kind of code switching where you're sort of smoothly moving back and forth between two entities. I think it's always just sort of beginning again and trying to find a voice for whatever this project might be. Certainly for me, I find it really, really hard to write anything. So it doesn't really matter what it is. It's always a struggle. There's a really good essay by Christian Wyman called A Piece of Prose that I read over and over again about how he seems to have the same experience of writing poetry as I do, which is that you spend more time not writing it than you do writing it. And so you have to kind of fill the space in between somehow. And he talks about how, when you go to write a poem, you have to be kind of prepared to go in and come back empty-handed most of the time. You don't get a poem out of writing poetry. But whereas with kind of academic work, it's not that it's easier, but that there's more of a chance that you're going to get something out of it. So I think writing academically becomes a kind of relief from writing poetry for that reason, and is a way of surviving being a poet.
Just to remind everybody, sorry, David, go on.
I was just
wondering,
go ahead, David. It was Henry James who said that thing, the much quoted line about a writer being somebody who finds it more difficult than other people to write. I mean, if that was the case with golfers or plumbers or bus drivers, the world would be in a terrible state of justice. But I mean, I think it's psychologically true, but it's something that one tells oneself to dress up what is often on a daily basis a state of just blank confusion. But then, you can't pull off the trick of, everybody knows the story about James just meeting somebody in the street, and he was looking very pleased with himself, and his friend says, how did the work go today? And he said, oh, it went brilliantly. Why? How much did you write? And the answer was one sentence. And I don't think that anecdote would make very much sense to Dickens or Trollope, these people who say that words a day. But they weren't writers in that Henry James sense of thinking, I can't do this. What's going on here? I'll write one sentence to turn it around this way, that way. What a brilliant success. What a great day I've had. So if you can apply that to your daily little pathetic failures and tell yourself it's all part of some master plan, which it may even be, that I think you're doing well.
And if not, sorry, just going there. If not failure, then certainly conflict and uncertainty seems to be part of your poetry. Ailbhe, you've said that a poem is a disagreement, which is a lovely phrase. But can you tell me what that means when you sit down to write it?
I don't remember saying that at all. Believe you.
It was a great line anyway. So if I were you, I would run with it.
I clearly threw out there. I don't know, but I suppose I may have meant that. You're not going to write a poem if you agree with yourself, right? If you something that you already agree with yourself on, then there's no point in getting into it. So a poem is always something that you're working out, something that you're going back and forth or in circles about. I have no idea if that's what I was talking about.
It's great, whatever.
That'll do.
Mike.
And just to remind everybody, if you have got questions for Ailbhe and David, please do type them into the text box. Joe, do you want to ask David about the political? I think we mentioned before we came on.
Yes, if you don't mind, David, actually, just thinking about the interweaving of politics and poetry in Ireland. Most recently, we all think of the pressure that Heaney was under and put himself under, perhaps. And obviously, we had the revolutionary poets of 1916, but far further back, of course, Ireland and the Ashling poetries of the 18th, 17th century and whatever else. So poetry and politics were deeply intermingled. And you've written about politics and about poetry in a particular essay I'm thinking of called The Political Poem Today. And I'm wondering actually about the business of writing political poetry, how you feel about that. You also particularly speak about the entitlement to speak. And that must be an issue I imagine that poets have to deal with when they're making these statements that are going to be read as pronouncements in that. The personal issue of, am I entitled to write about these things? And is there anything that you'd like to speak to us about that, please?
Well, I have the enviable distinction of doing some of my teaching here in the School of Celtic Studies, and I was teaching a course on Irish language writing just last year, and we were talking about bardic poetry, and to explain the concept of the political poem within that world. It was an interesting experience for me, because most of the bardic poets, what were their politics? I mean, their politics were those of their patrons. There was just a perceived unification there of the artistic enterprise and the politics that you needed to parrot from your patron. But the modern conception of the political poem is, of course, very different. Now, Ailbhe was talking about disagreeing with yourself. I imagine if I forced myself to read the old essay of mine you've just mentioned, I probably would find a lot to disagree. But straining my memory, I do remember talking about the much quoted line of Shelley's about poets being unacknowledged legislators. I think I was telling my students last year that I would now read that as a sense of falling from the power and the privilege that a bardic poet once enjoyed when there was an aristocratic patron to back it up. Now, many people pile on with that line of Shelley's and choose to read it as a piece of nostalgia or self-delusion on the part of the poet. But there's a very elegant inversion of it by the American poet George Oppen, who said that poets are the legislators of the unacknowledged. And so I think that's a very modest way of recuperating that sense of utopianism, that you can indeed find a sphere in which to exercise poetic power with legislative force, but it will tend to be the unacknowledged. Like you could be the world's legislator for sunshine coming in through your bathroom window or something, rather than fixing wars in a poem.
Great, that's great. And just the other issue that was in that was the question of I guess authenticity and the right of poets to speak, not necessarily on politics. I mean, their entitlement to speak. And I just wonder if that's an issue that poets deal with, their entitlement to speak. What degree of self-confidence does it take in order to publish one's own thoughts within poetry? How easy is that?
Well, I mean, obviously, you're talking to people who have just got ahead and done it. I mean, it takes chutzpah, indeed. And just because you have done it doesn't mean that it was right or wrong, that you aren't tormented with pangs of guilt about one's own inauthenticity. Here I am in Scotland, and I've occasionally written things in Scots. And, it would take a lot of chutzpah get to go talk in Scots in the co-op. They might think I was just taking the mickey or something. But I just get to do it in my poems. So, I mean, yes, you take the plunge and you do it, for better or for worse.
Fabulous.
Okay, so just moving on then. So, I mean, obviously one thing we've touched on is the fact that both of you are living outside Ireland. So when you think about your own poetry and you talk about your own poetry, how does that fit into, or how might it fit into the sort of traditions that have been identified as either Irish or diasporic, or maybe you're both? Ailbhe?
Well, yes, good question. I think, I mean, you can start from the idea, can't you, that being away from Ireland is an Irish experience, right? Ireland is an island, and there's been comings and goings all along. So I think that is a kind of a quintessential Irish experience. Obviously, my experience of being away is rather more privileged than past experiences of it. But I think also, I mean, something in my poetry that I think kind of carries a tradition with it is, I think when you talk about traditions, you're talking about conversations, right? You're talking about conversations that take place in poetry, across poems, through form and through approach and so on. And one thing that I see in my own poetry, just talking about South Bend again, that we were just talking about, is a kind of obsession with place, which you see again and again in the Irish tradition, right? You see, you know, from the Din Shankas poems to kind of Patrick Kavanagh's obsession with the local, and then, you know, Paul Meehan kind of honouring inner city Dublin. So I think there's a sense in which, you know, my poetry has just taken that and sort of carried it over to Midwestern America and gone to this sort of arbitrary place and sings of its importance, right, and tells stories about it. So that's one way that I would see my poetry as fitting in. David, what do you think?
Well, like yourself, Ailbhe, I live in one of the Celtic corners of this archipelago, and I've been living in Scotland for almost a decade now, and it's very Irish in some ways. I mean, it took the Irish saints, people like Drosten and Turner and Adamnan, to come and Christianise the locals, who were Picts, apparently, which is a kind of obscure, vanished culture, leaving mysterious traces behind. And so when I connect with that, I feel that I'm connecting with a sense of a minority or invisible culture, which then reflects back on my sense of what I'm doing as an Irish poet here. So, you know, you might think that connecting to Scotland, it's a bridge, a land bridge almost across back to Ireland. But I'd say yes, but in a peculiar kind of inside out way. For instance, I mean, if you look at the Scots Gaelic, which, you know, is a strong part of Scottish culture, and when one speaks it, it's like talking Donegal Irish, and you think, well, is this the correct accent? What is one's accent when you handle this material? Does it become your accent? Can you inhabit this except in a kind of pantomime form? But I mean, as we were saying about just going ahead and doing it, whether you feel authentic or not, I found it an enabling inauthenticity, if that's what it is, finally.
Enabling inauthenticity. Did I hear you properly? That's a lovely phrase. Thanks very, very much. Just as we're talking about older poetry there, David, you're described, and again, I'm terrible if I'm quoting things from long ago from people indeed, and I think that maybe you described it as a kind of 10th century old Irish lyric modernist. And I don't know if that's something that you would still claim, or you think that's too ridiculous, but I think it's rather wonderful. And it makes me think perhaps of Flann O'Brien, of course, who also was somebody who had great skills in Old Irish. I think that's what his primary degree in UCD was. And indeed, of course, he was a modernist, or maybe a postmodernist, if that's what pleases you. And I wonder if the humor in your poetry, the quirkiness that I find here and there, owes anything at all to Flann O'Brien.
Well, it certainly does. And you're reminding me now of the wonderfully absurd occasion where he goes to, I think, a Gaelic League party, and he's seated beside a man who can only speak Old Irish and English. He can't speak modern Irish. And scholar that he is, I mean, Flann O'Brien starts talking to him. But then they decide, I think, between them that what we speak today is Old Irish because it's very old now, and the tongue that they're talking is Young Irish, and we've got it completely the wrong way around. But I mean, Flann O'Brien is a very good example too. He didn't have to move to Scotland to experience this because, as people know, he grew up speaking Irish in an English-speaking area. He spoke Irish in the home, and he was, I believe, bullied in the playground for this, but he lived in a kind of one-man private Gaeltacht. I believe as well, if he saw him in a pub in Dublin in the 60s and fancied having a chat with him in Irish, it didn't tend to go well. But, you know, I don't think chats in English went well either.
No.
So the comic aspect is, you know, very, very fruitful in these debates.
Yeah. But also that you find clearly quite a lot of inspiration from that old Irish poetry.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's some lovely translations. Flann O'Brien, you know, he doesn't seem very poetic. You know, in fact, he has a running gag about his absolute hatred of poetry readings in Crushkey and Lawn. But he did some very fine translations of old Irish poetry. Maybe for that famous MA thesis, which was failed and then resubmitted unchanged, and which passed.
Great. That's great. Thanks very much. I wonder if we should, Mike. Sorry, Mike. No?
No, I was just going to move on. Obviously, one thing that's happening at the end of this month is your edited Cambridge History of Irish Women's Poetry is due to be launched or released onto the world. So do you just want to take us back? I know it's taken you, you put huge amounts of work into this, and it's a work of huge breadth, and it's important. But you want to just explain a bit of the background about how this Cambridge History of Irish Women's Poetry originated?
Sure. I suppose we started talking about it in 2018, which is when the Cambridge Companion to Irish Poets came out. And there was a great deal of disappointment at the scope of that volume. So there's 30 poets in it, and only 4 of them were women. And just a sense that that volume hadn't taken advantage of the enormous wealth of scholarship that there now is on poetry by women. So I think for David and myself, that sense of disappointment kind of moved to a realization that this was a really right moment, that there was a really keen appetite for some kind of authoritative guide to Irish women's poetry across time, and that there was a kind of a moment where all this work had sort of come together, and it was time for that work to be consolidated. So that was the idea, and it was obviously an exciting one and a daunting one, because it's a big opportunity to kind of make critical interventions that are kind of field defining, and that will hopefully change how we think about the history of Irish poetry. But obviously, also because of that, a huge responsibility. So I think we kind of reached out to potential contributors, and then the way they came back with so much enthusiasm and commitment, I think that's when the project kind of became a goer. They were really on board for this one.
It's fabulous. It's fabulous. I'd particularly like to hear just a little bit about early Irish poetry and women poets in early Ireland. There is one section called, I don't know that I have it here, women poetry and the business of medieval women poetry, or something like that. And it started at the word business. In what sense was it a business? And started as well that there were more than just monks scribbling in manuscript edges. Can you tell us just a little bit, or are you familiar with that? About the women of poetry before Eileen Govney Connell and whatever.
Well, there's a lovely chapter, extremely dense and authoritative chapter by the aforementioned Maureen Ní Chorracha on these themes. And I was teaching that course I mentioned about Bardic poetry as I was reading about this and as your chapter was coming in. But the business to be a poet, then to be a professional poet, I believe there were 9 levels of entitlement to speak as a poet, with the or the filler at the very top. But if you were sitting at a pub or something and fancy doing a satirical ditty, I mean, you wouldn't have the same entitlement to speak. It'd be, I think the word for that is a fucklach. But women, without being professional bards, if they were attached to court circles and things, or were people of note, like abbesses, let's say, their marginalia, their quatrains and things would find their way into their written record in surprising ways. Excellent. And so, I mean, because I was starting in my teaching from Daniel Corkery's The Hidden Ireland, which is such, it's such a propagandist work, really, but it's so embedded in our sense of cultural history that what I was reading in Maureen's chapter then took me by surprise. Corkery had done maybe an unconscious and self-conscious job of editing this stuff out of the record, for the usual very cultural nationalistic reasons that the woman is the poem rather than the poet. Yes, so that there's a lot here to get your teeth into when the book comes out, just in terms of things, information, receiving all these new readings of things that will seem startling, I hope.
Fabulous, fabulous. And if we go again, I'm speaking out of total ignorance there, if we go just past the medieval poets, women poets of, say, the 18th and 19th century, in Irish, is there anything that we should know about that? Where did they go to?
Ailbhe? I printed out the contents page because we're currently, as you know, in the enjoyable hiatus, the interregnum between submission and publication.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the list here. There's a chapter by Trina Ní Hiach on the oral tradition from that time.
That's right.
Leading into that period of parallel production of, when people writing in English and Irish alongside one another without any knowledge of what the other side was doing, as it were, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.
Obviously, just to broaden this out, obviously, it's a huge chronological span you've got here. So for people listening in who maybe they're really looking forward to the publication of this book, the actual arrival of it in their hand, but can you just summarize for people who are listening the chronological and also the critical scope of the edition?
Well, it's huge. I mean, as Joe was saying, it goes right back to the medieval time, and it takes in the oral tradition as well as the written tradition. So I mean, that was very important to us to sort of communicate that women's poetry, you know, it predates the idea of the nation state. Women have been contributing to the making of poetry sort of all along. And we took a really plural and inclusive approach in all those times, right? So we're looking at sort of these multiple traditions. We're looking at multiple versions of Irishness. So we're looking at migrant and diasporic poetry. We're looking at poetry, of course, in more than one language. We're looking at poetry across the borders. So we wanted to, you know, do justice to things like the avant-garde and modernist tradition in Ireland, you know, the full wealth of the Irish language tradition, and then coming up right to today to new communities and poets outside of Ireland who maybe aren't always considered Irish poets, but you know, are writing into the tradition and sometimes writing about Ireland. So yeah, it's big and baggy, and that was quite important as well. Not to just tell one story, but to tell lots of stories, and not to try and create a sense that there is a history, right? There's lots of histories, and you know, it's been much pointed out that the history of women's poetry is very fragmented in Ireland, and to sort of do honour to that. And not try to pretend otherwise was quite important to us.
I noticed from just having a look at the list of participants this evening that quite a few of the authors of chapters are tuning in too, and would have very interesting things to say. I personally enjoyed being overtaken by the subject as we approach the present day and learning about authors, people who've come to prominence since I left the country, and Anne Mulhall's chapter at the end of the book, constellation of writers, some of whom have come from overseas, and in some cases Anne was writing about books that hadn't even been published yet. One I've just been reading in proof that's coming out next month. And yeah, there will be lots to say about that.
Can I ask specifically, and of course we're talking about English and Irish language poetry here, can I ask specifically about the state of Irish language poetry at the moment, among women and indeed among male writers, but particularly among the great women like Moira Wheatley and Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill and Whereas, who've done such absolutely fabulous work. How does she stand right now?
David, do you want to speak?
It looks to be really good health. I mean, we have anthologue chapters. I can't remember how many. Some chapters on single authors, but that isn't the usual format. But some of those would include chapter by Patricia Coughlin on Moira Wheatley, one by myself on the mysterious Biddy Jenkinson, and then we have a chapter on more recent Irish language poetry by Afric McKay, for instance, and Ailbhe and David. And yes, I think that the old sense of, you know, the obligatory homage to Mother Ireland, the Corkery model, has been very profitably exploded. A whole plethora of new approaches instead. But no, I think that there's an awful lot to say about these younger writers who I see coming through in new anthologies again, like a recent Gallery Press anthology of younger Irish language poets.
Yeah, we also have a chapter, a wonderful chapter by Ken Keating on bilingual poetry. So thinking of poetry that's kind of existing in both languages, poets who are publishing simultaneously in both languages, and looking in that back and forth. So not sort of keeping the two traditions separate, but understanding them as something that are both separate and entwined.
And is it in any sense a useful question to wonder actually whether Irish language poetry has taken on, as I presume, a more urban image than it was? I presume, where are these young poets coming from? Are they coming from the Gaeltacht? Are they coming from modern Gaeltachtaí? Are they coming from the cities or anything? Or can we generalize at all about them? Are we just seeing a general sprouting of grand poetry?
Would it be accurate to say that they do still indeed come from the Gaeltacht and often write about this stuff from internal exile in the cities,
Right.
whether Galway, Cork, or Dublin?
Right.
And
Yeah.
just one thing, what do you think? I mean, given that this comes out of the companion and that avoidance or lack of inclusion of women poets, what do you think the significance of this edition is and will be moving forward? Because I mean, it's a big statement, and it's a very important statement.
Well, so when that happened in 2018, so one response to that was a movement which you may remember called Fired, which was a group of women poets who came together. People like Christine Murray, Mary O'Donnell, and Kathy Darcy were kind of leading that. And we put together a pledge as part of that group. And did loads of other things as well, like there was a series of events, kind of hedge schools with people getting together and teaching each other and reading poetry to each other by women poets. So a kind of self-education. But for that pledge, which was a kind of, it was a pledge where people who were involved in the poetry scene in Ireland or the literary scene could sort of sign up to say, that they would ask questions about gender parity, so that if, as editors or as organisers or whatever it might be, that they would ask, just ask if it was happening, and that they wouldn't take part in events or publications that didn't involve gender parity. And there was a kind of preamble to that pledge, which I remember asked, you know, when we have these publications that marginalize women, kind of recreate this sense that there were no women poets before the 1960s or whatever, what message are we sending to young and emerging scholars and poets? Are we telling them that their contribution is going to be deemed less valuable? So for me, I think this book is kind of a letter to those young and emerging scholars and poets. Say, well, no, right? We're going to be reading you. We're going to engage with you. So I think that's kind of the first significance of the book is to reach those emerging poets and scholars. I think the other significance of the book is Anne Fogarty has a wonderful introductory essay for the book, where she talks about how all the kind of feminist tactics that we see in Irish poetry today, so things like women running publishing presses, mentorship, patronage, self-promotion and so on, all those kinds of tactics, we've seen them before, right? They're not new. Women throughout history have been doing these things. So one thing we learned by looking at the history of Irish women's poetry is that those things are not enough, that they have to be answered by readers. Readers have to engage with the poetry and interpret the poetry and become intimate with the poetry. So this book is, well, doing that. Each chapter is, providing an intimacy with the poetry. And I think that's kind of the significance, that it will allow readers to have that intimacy, and it will allow that engagement with the poetry.
Ailbhe has mentioned the excellent chapter towards the beginning of the book by Anne Fogarty about anthologies. But something I found very revealing about that chapter was the way in which it rendered very problematic the idea of a progressive and evolutionary chart journeying towards inclusiveness. Because if anything, I mean, the anthologies from the period maybe the 60s to the 80s were some of the least inclusive of the century. If you take mid-century anthologies, and they were still kind of maybe dutifully including revivalist women poets, who then just fell away completely. And to the nadir of Kinsla's Oxford book, which, I mean, literally includes no women at all. The only one is Evelyn Duffney-Cuddle, who is in his translation. So I think that meant that for somebody of my vintage, I was receiving a very skewed sense of literary history, even quite recent literary history. But I think that the paradigm then that was very much in place when I was a young man was one of a kind of hand-washing passivity, so that the editors challenged on this and would say, well, I'm not seeing this work coming in to the letterbox. And there the argument rests. As though you can't just go and, you know, make things happen, just shake things up, have a special issue of your magazine, do whatever it takes, rather than just present yourself as being at the mercy of these somehow unchangeable forces, because it just wasn't true, nor was it an accurate reflection of Irish literary history.
And far from unchangeable, you're changed them. And I had a question here from Patrick O'Sullivan, actually, looking forward, of course, to a history of Irish women's poetry. And wonders if you're able to say anything about relationships, your relationships presumably with Cambridge University Press, who are publishing much Irish material. Also, he says your book's a history rather than a companion in the Cambridge style. Does that mean anything? He wonders. Anything to say about that?
Well, I don't know what to say about our relationship with Cambridge. It's been a delight.
Good.
Yeah,
They've
been really helpful. Yeah, and I mean they jumped on the project really, and anything were kind of pushing us to complete it. A history versus a companion. Well, I mean the companion is a particular Cambridge beast, right? It's a sort of it's what the grad student reaches for when they have to teach a course that they're not prepared for, right? So it's a kind of a comfortable introduction to something. Right. Where history, I think, is bringing something together. It's really a consolidating volume, bringing together, you know, work that's been done over many years, and does kind of give this kind of comprehensive sweep of women's poetry from a long time ago to now. So yes, I think it's a different kind of volume. I don't know, David, what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, I think that where Cambridge are concerned, I'm aware that Ray Ryan, he spent time at Aberdeen as well, but maybe he had some kind of moment of enlightenment there about how he could serve Irish studies from a distance. He's done such sterling work. I mean, so many great volumes. And a series of books that he's sponsored and helped in.
That's right.
He was indeed only entirely encouraging of the whole project. And when we had slips along the way when people weren't able to write a chapter, we had to get somebody else even at short notice. He was entirely understanding of that. I guess, sorry, go on.
I guess just moving away just from that for a moment, indeed, I'm just wondering about the state of Irish poetry and about anxieties and influences. I mean, are there any great towering figures? Who are the great towering figures that people are afraid of as they sit down to write poetry nowadays? I'm thinking about anxieties of influence. I'm thinking about Heaney worrying at one stage, are being accused of writing as if Yeats were always looking over his shoulder. And I think he says that he'd like to think that all poets should write as if Yeats were looking over their shoulder. Who looks over Irish poets' shoulders these days, one wonders, in making you tremble or perhaps encouraging you?
Good grief. I mean, thinking about women's poetry, thinking about writing poetry as a woman, I think Eva Boland has become that kind of
course.
In both ways, that she's a towering, terrifying figure, but also someone who's there at the desk,
right.
You know, who thinks of the rooms of other women poets and is a companion. So yeah, for me, that would be the answer.
Sure.
Well, there's been a kind of a terrible harvest of senior Irish poets dying off of late, people in their 70s or 80s. And you begin to wonder that, I mean, do people who are maybe only 10 or 15 years older than you are, do they have to become one's, you know, feared elders? Or are they the kind of Easter Island statues in the landscape these days? Until eventually there's nobody left who's older than you, and you have to internalize all this for yourself.
That's really great.
And then just one question, obviously working as the editors on this collection, was there anything particular that struck you or surprised you as you worked through the different essays and the different materials?
I mean, every single essay was full of surprises. It's just been a revelation. I mean, there's a particular chapter which is a whole new poet, which is Moina Sullivan's chapter on Carla Lanyon, who I had not heard of at all before this. So Carla Lanyon was a poet who was publishing between 1928 and 1968, and she published 11 collections. She had a novel. She was anthologized. She was publishing in like kind of top magazines on both sides of the Atlantic. She was editing. She was winning all the prizes. She was, she did everything right. And then somehow she falls away. Moina says she's hiding in plain view. She's there, but we're not reading her. So Moina reads her, and she reads in her poetry a kind of refusal of the kind of make it new, modernism and modernity, and reads a kind of a proto-environmentalism in her, I think, which makes her a really full poet to read, obviously right at this minute for us. So that for me was really exciting to have a whole new poet.
The poet I'd put alongside the reduplicatively named Lanyon would be Lola Ridge. I mean, who has been discovered going back a couple of years now, courtesy of Daniel Tobin. But such a wonderful writer with strange connections to people like the American objectivists. And, she had a very all over the place kind of life. I mean, she was born in Dublin, then she went to New Zealand, then Australia, then San Francisco, and then New York. And usually when people were aware of her, they'd say, well, she isn't really an Irish poet. Like, she tries to write an Irish nationalist ballad, and she writes it to be called Kelvin Barry instead of Kevin Barry. So you think you're looking at a certain distance from the norms and pieties of Irish poetry, but then you think, well, you're pathologizing her by saying that. In fact, she's entirely representative of what it means to be a diaspora poet, even when she just gets it wrong. And yes, I mean, I think she's a really important modernist poet with a lot of things to say about modernism and Irish poetry, and how they do or don't encounter each other halfway.
Can I just remind everybody, sorry, Ailbhe, very quickly, I just want to remind everybody that don't send us questions at 29 minutes past 10 because we won't have time to read them out. So while Ailbhe's speaking now, get your questions in. Sorry, Ailbhe.
Well, I was just going to add another thing really, which is the creative practices in the oral tradition were another chapter that really kind of blew my mind. Trina Ní has written a chapter for us about that. And like, obviously I knew kind of vaguely about the oral tradition and how it worked, but I mean, she just really evokes it so amazingly, the kind of total immersion in the oral tradition, and then this practice of composing in performance, and just how really extraordinary that is, and how alien to anything we do now. And there's just, there's kind of anecdotes in that chapter, like she talks about Bess Cronin, the sean-nós singer, as a child waking up in the morning and hearing women singing downstairs and coming down, and there's a kind of a kitchen full of women and they're all churning butter and cooking and sewing and singing this song, and she asks them to teach her the song, and they say, well, yeah, we will, of course, because before breakfast is the best time to learn something. So her evocation of this world was just just really stunning for me.
Sorry, Joe, please.
Yes, I just have a simple question there, actually, from something that you said, David, earlier about Biddy Jenkinson. And Paula Deere wonders, actually, what is the mystery? I'm afraid you used the adjective mysterious, I think, about Biddy Jenkinson, and he wants to know what the mystery is. And presumably,
there are various mysteries, but first, that's not her actual name. I am aware of her real name. She has chosen to publish and write under a pseudonym. The second is, the fact that people know about her is that she declines to allow her work to be translated into English. She refers to that as one small rude gesture in the face of the assumption that everything can be harvested back over into English. And well, in the chapter, I quote the lines without translation. I shunt the translation into a footnote or an endnote.
Oh yeah, yes, I see. Right,
but I mean, it was a real. I'm not going to say endurance test, but it was certainly grueling working on her poetry, because it's very, very dense Irish. It reminds me a lot of the early 20th century Irish language poet Liam Mescogan, somebody who worked with Deneen on his dictionary. It's, it's not something you'd want to read without a copy of Deneen's dictionary close to hand. In fact, she has written a couple of books now about Father Deneen, who she has reinvented as a detective.
Fabulous. He gets a walk-on part almost as a detective. Of course, in Ulysses, he pops into the library and disappears.
He does indeed.
So maybe he was a bit of a detective. Great stuff. Lovely. I like that. And sorry, please, who's Mike?
No, it's a question from Nancy, wondering if someone on the panel could list the book title and publisher and date of publication.
Oh, yes.
So it's Cambridge University Press. The publication date is 2021, hopefully by the end of this month.
The end of June, yeah.
And it's the history of Irish women's poetry.
Okay.
Correct?
Correct.
And then just moving on, I mean, one question would be that if we think about the importance about Ireland as a diversified island, how does poetry reflect that?
Well, so we have a chapter by Anne Mulhall that thinks about that. And specifically in the spoken word scene, I think particularly, so the spoken word scene in Ireland has been one of the most important developments in poetry, I think, in the last couple of decades. And women and Black and ethnic minority poets have been at the forefront of that. And that's somewhere where you again see this idea of poetry as a kind of a social world, right? As needing social things to happen, because the spoken word scene is one where it's only happening because of things like the Fried Plantain Collective and We Are Riot, sort of creating communal spaces where poetry can take place. So that's what Anne writes about in that chapter. David, I don't know if you need to add to that.
Right.
Oh, I mean, you can connect that to the Irish language question too, when you see,
Sure.
it breaking the assumption that the Irish language is only the property of a conservative or backward-looking, inward-looking approach to Irish poetry. When people might, move to the country from Germany, Nigeria, even, and immerse themselves in that, without maybe some of the hang-ups that would afflict people merely born in Ireland in their approach. I get the same thing in Scotland with I get visiting students who have no hang-ups about wanting to immerse themselves in indigenous languages, but to see that happening to Irish poetry too produces some very unexpected results, which it's been my pleasure to catch up on in that chapter.
Wonderful. And I see a chapter about Catholicism in women, Catholicism, modern Irish poetry, Katrina Clutterbuck. And, women's issues over the last few decades, and women's history in Ireland, over the 20th century in particular, has been one in contention, in conflict, in subjugation, in so many words I can throw out there, actually, relating to the Catholic Church there. So it's hardly surprising if that emerges, is vocalized through the poetry. Anything that you'd like to say about that chapter? Was there anything that struck you within that? I wonder, Ailbhe or David?
It's an extraordinary chapter. It's a really fantastic chapter. I think, women poets really have been at the forefront again of thinking about the Catholic Church, about its role in Ireland and its role in Irish women's lives. Not just resisting the church, but also thinking about what might be salvaged from that tradition.
Right.
So she's looking at people like Maeve McGuckian and Elanian who engage with faith and with kind of the iconography of the Catholic Church in intimate ways, right? Not just resisting it. So yeah, it's a really really fantastic chapter.
Yeah,
it's worth mentioning, I suppose, that chapter, when it came in first, I think it was around 25,000 words long, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Absolutely cutting. Yeah, there might be a monograph there.
It isn't the only chapter in the book which does a lot of very hard work of sociological analysis of understanding the background, the history, which is deep and extremely important to understand. But at the same time, it and other chapters like Maria Johnston's chapter on Elaine Quillinan are just tributes to the astonishing and serene, luminous art that results from this struggle and engagement.
And then what would you really want kind of readers to take away from this collection once they've worked their way through it, worked through a few hundred years of women's poetry? I mean, what?
I hope they'll just, I mean, I think it's going to be just a huge pleasure to discover what is just an inheritance, right? I think it's going to be a revelation of an inheritance that they've been entitled to, that they've always had, and that hasn't been accessible in the way that it is now. And I think they'll see that women poets have always been doing this kind of crucial work in our national imagination. And that you know, we lose out when we don't listen to what they have to say about who we might be. So yeah, I think a revelation is what I would be saying. Yeah, David, what do you think?
Well, we can't really skirt the fact that people in search of this revelation, unless they have access to a good library, will have to pay £85 for it.
Well, that's true.
But it's also worth mentioning that if enough people do pay £85, that I think that the publisher might consider doing a cheaper format paperback as well.
Absolutely wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Indeed. And one hopes that there's room in school curricula for a book like this.
Yeah.
Nowadays. You know, you people have been obviously extremely busy and continue to be extremely busy on this project. I don't know if you have time for any other things in your lives, like writing poetry. Is there room to write poetry? Is there anything? And I guess I'm really, in fact, thinking about the moment that we're in and the very peculiar circumstance out of which we're all attempting to emerge. Do you think, and you don't have to speak about yourselves on this, but I mean, do you think that this is something that will bring forth poetry? Will it change anything as we look back upon this, do you imagine? As for people who are going to be writing the history of poetry in some years to come, any idea how they'll feel about this? Or you can speak about your own if you wish to.
Gosh, I mean, there is already poetry emerging, right? There's been a couple of books have come out from it already. I mean, I think the main thing, when I'm speaking for myself, I think the main thing is there's a kind of inequality of opportunity there, because I certainly didn't write a poem during the pandemic. I was incredibly busy schooling and trying to teach online at the same time. So for me, it's, you know, I'm sort of reeling, and I've written a very small number of poems since as things have quietened down. So it's sort of amazing to see these people who've been incredibly bored and have been writing steadily. I have no idea. What we might, how we might.
Right. One wonders if there's a lot of people out there who've never written poetry before, who now finding time in their lives.
You might emerge. Yes, that'd be wonderful.
What kind of buds and blossoms are there that might yet be seen? David, your experience has been?
Well, I mean, I feel very guilt-tripped now by what Ailbhe just said, because as she knows, I've spent the last couple of months actually writing a novel, which despite what I was saying about James Joyce and the single sentence today, I used to write, because I finished now, by giving the children their porridge in the morning and then cranking out a mandatory 500 words a day, and I just stop at the end of it. I'd be watching the word count. I was Trollope and Dickens, not James Joyce. whether anybody wants to publish it. Dark side of what you said is that we've had this explosion of writing during lockdown. Maybe none of it's any good, and nobody will want to publish the stuff. You know, swings and roundabouts.
You don't have to tell us the theme of the novel, but does it anywhere reflect upon cover? Does it emerge in any?
No, I don't mention that.
Good. Perfectly happy with that. That's wonderful. Mike?
Brilliant. We're out of time, so that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And everybody, just to re-emphasise, end of the month, the Cambridge History of Women's Irish Poetry. Go get your copy. And don't worry about the cost. It's a really important contribution, and I think it will be brilliantly received. So thank you for the chat. Can I talk about next week, Joe, very quickly?
Yes, do please, Mike. Do please.
Except as I try and get this sorted out. Except, people, there is no next week.
Yes.
We've kind of reached the end of our usual kind of week in, week out. And aware that the summer evenings are beginning and the evenings getting longer. So we've made the decision what we're going to do is just meet every fortnight during the summer. We've got an interesting range of people to talk to, and in 2 weeks' time, Friday, 11th of June at 9:30 Irish time, 4:30 East Coast USA. We're talking to Barry McRae, author and critic. And obviously that week, I think that maybe the following week, he's organising the Irish seminar for Notre Dame and the South Bend connection. And at the end of the month, on 25th of June, from over in Galway, Nessa Crone is going to talk to us about environmentalism. So lots of interesting things come up. As usual, if you're not sure and you want a reminder, register on Eventbrite, you'll get it there. If you want to watch tonight's brilliant chat or any of the previous ones, it's on YouTube. Again, type in Irish Influence and you'll see it there. But
Thanks very much, Mike. And indeed,
thank
and
you very
again,
much,
that's
Ailbhe.
just,
Thank you, David. Brilliant.
that's absolutely. Thank you both, Ailbhe. Thank you, Ailbhe, and thank you very, very much, David. And everybody, remember, that's only for the summer. That is every fortnight or every 2 weeks, as they say in America. And come fall, that means autumn, then we will return actually to our regular weekly form. So thanks very much, everybody. Good to see you. Bye-bye.